Today, we're diving into something pretty cool. This idea that our stories, yeah, everything from Shakespeare to the latest streaming hits, aren't just sitting on the sidelines of history. They're in the game, actively shaping it. We're going to unpack two big theories, new historicism and cultural materialism, that show us the hidden power plays happening in the culture all around us. So, let me ask you this. Is a play by Shakespeare just as important, historically, as a peace treaty? I know, it sounds a little out there, right? But what if I told you there are a couple of major schools of thought that would shout a definite yes to that? They believe that the stuff we watch and read isn't just fluff. It's a real player in the power struggles that define every single era. Okay, so before we jump into our two competing theories, we need to get on the same page about three key ideas they both share. Think of this as grabbing our toolkit before we get to work. We've got text, ideology, and power. First up, let's talk about what a text is. And I want you to just forget the image of a library for a second. For these thinkers, a text is basically anything we can read for meaning. A play, sure, but also a law, a medical diagnosis, even how people celebrate a holiday. They see all of these as interconnected texts that weave together the very fabric of a culture. Next up, ideology. Now, the best way to think about this is like a society's invisible operating system. It's all the stuff that just feels like common sense, you know? The, that's just the way things are, beliefs that we rarely ever question. But what ideology really does is make the interests of the powerful seem like they're just normal and in everyone's best interest. It's the air we breathe. So how does this operating system get installed? Well, the philosopher Louis Althusser gave us a really useful map. He said you have the things that control us by force, the army, the police. He called that the repressive state apparatus. But then you have the ideological state apparatuses. These are the institutions like schools, family, churches, and the media. They do the same job, but way more subtly. They get us to agree to the system, to consent to it, all without ever firing a shot. And that brings us to our final tool, power. Now, if you're picturing a king on a throne barking orders, you gotta toss that image out. Thanks to the philosopher Michel Foucault, we have a much more complex idea of power. He saw it as a network that runs through everything. It doesn't just say no, it's productive. It creates knowledge, it defines what's normal, it shapes our desires. It literally builds our reality. Okay, toolkit assembled, let's meet our first theory. This one was born mostly in the United States, and it's called New Historicism. And I gotta tell you, it takes a pretty tough, maybe even a little pessimistic look at that whole network of power. So the big name here is Stephen Greenblatt, and he came up with this killer concept called subversion and containment. The idea is that the system of power is so incredibly smart and all-encompassing that it actually allows for little acts of rebellion. Why? So it can then absorb them, manage them, and in the end, use them to make itself even stronger. This quote really hits the nail on the head. It points out this huge dilemma. How can you possibly fight a system when the only tools you have to fight with, your language, your ideas, your sense of self, were given to you by that very system? It's like trying to tear down the master's house using the master's tools. Any attempt to critique it just gets sucked right back in. It's a pretty chilling thought. Okay, I know this sounds super abstract, so let's look at a concrete example. New historicists are famous for analyzing colonial texts, and one of their go-to case studies is how European culture basically invented the modern idea of the cannibal to justify its own actions. Because when you actually go back and read the proof, it is unbelievably flimsy. You have Columbus, who hears about cannibals from a rival tribe but never actually sees any himself. You have the explorer Stanley finding some bones near a village dump and just assuming it was from a cannibal feast. He even admits that a threat he thought he heard might have just been a mistranslation of the word for meat. It's totally circular logic. They already assumed the natives were savages, so any little thing was twisted into proof. And here's the containment part. This invented threat, this idea of the savage cannibal, didn't actually weaken the European power structure. No way! It was the perfect excuse. It proved that the natives needed to be civilized, which in turn justified conquest, violence, and total control. The system created a threat, then contained it to make itself even more powerful. See how that works? All right, if new historicism is feeling a little bleak, let's hop across the Atlantic and meet its British cousin, cultural materialism. It uses the same basic toolkit, text, ideology, power, but it's got a much more optimistic, politically charged spin on things.
For thinkers like Raymond Williams and Alan Sinfield, power is never this perfect, seamless machine. They look at a society and say, hold on a minute. They argue that the dominant ideology is always messy, full of contradictions, and what they call fault lines. And it's right there, in those cracks and gaps, that real challenges and real resistance can actually bubble up.
Let's look at an example. Take Tennyson's famous poem, In Memoriam. Now, the official, dominant reading is that it's this very proper, very Victorian poem about grieving a dear friend. Totally respectable. But cultural materialists read it against the grain. They look at the incredibly passionate language and argue that, no, this is actually a dissident text. It's expressing a deep homosexual love in an era where that was becoming a crime. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, where you can see the power struggle play out. Apparently, this dissident reading of the poem was so potent, so threatening, that Queen Victoria herself, the Queen, supposedly edited a version of it. She changed pronouns to make it clearly about a husband and wife. But for a cultural materialist, that's not a sign that power won. It's a sign that power was scared.
So you see, the very act of trying to shut down that other meaning proves it was there and that it was powerful. It shows the dominant system isn't perfect. It has to constantly work and fight to stay on top. For cultural materialists, our books and movies aren't just artifacts of power. They are battlegrounds where different meanings are always fighting it out.
So, okay, we've got two powerful theories that start with the same ingredients but cook up two totally different meals. So why should we care about this academic debate from the 80s? Well, because these aren't just theories. They're two completely different lenses for looking at the world we live in right now. Let's just break it down side by side. You've got New Historicism from the US, which tends to see power as this inescapable web that's brilliant at containing any challenge. It's more of a descriptive academic approach. Then you've got Cultural Materialism from the UK. It sees power as flawed, full of cracks, and always vulnerable to resistance. It's way more optimistic and wants to find ways to actually make a change. And really, that's the bottom line. This stuff isn't just for English majors. These are practical tools for all of us. They teach us to stop just passively consuming the culture around us and to start actively reading it. They give us permission to look at a movie, a news report, even a political ad, and start asking some really sharp questions.
And that's the question they leave us with. When you look at any story being told, ask yourself, is this just propping up the status quo, containing any real challenge? Or can you spot the cracks? Can you find the contradictions, the little moments of resistance that hint at a completely different story trying to get out? In a way, New Historicism shows us the cage, while cultural materialism tries to hand us the keys. The real question is, which one are you seeing?